Okay, Philosophy of God, lecture on Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. That's my volume right there. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Don't know how many people who are teaching this book, period, but much less begin class with the Our Father. Anyway, this isn't exactly a philosophy book, nor is A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. These are more sort of pop. I'm not even sure what category this would fit into. This is pop science, and for what it is, it's pretty good. There's the weaknesses we'll talk about next week. I'm not even sure what sort of genre this would be in. Certainly not philosophy. And I don't think Richard Dawkins would care to be called a philosopher in the first place. He doesn't have much respect for philosophy, it seems like. It's not exactly a science book. It's certainly not a science book. So anyway, whatever. Genre's kind of a arbitrary thing anyway. I wonder if it says what genre it is somewhere in the book. Right? Because it's got to be on a particular shelf at Barnes & Noble and not others. Irreligion, atheism, God, religion. Those are the categories there. All right, sure. Why am I having you read this book, or the sort of middle of it, when it's not philosophy? Well, he certainly talks about philosophical themes. Are there better books to read, or sort of stronger arguments to make against God's existence? Absolutely. Why didn't I have you read those? To be very honest with you, it's kind of hard to sift through them. There really isn't a kind of go-to sort of manual on atheism, and I chose this one because it's, I think, by far the most popular, and it's representative enough. Some of the arguments, they get very, very technical, and what they will do, there's a volume, you can actually see it, I think it's that book right there, the bluish one. That entire shelf is mostly books on atheism, but one of them is a sort of collection of philosophical essays. What those generally do is they will choose one premise of arguments in favor of God's existence, such as Aquinas's, and they'll pick like the premise, I don't know, everything that moves is moved by another, and they'll just be like kind of a very thorough essay just talking about that. Even those of I think there's good ways to answer them, but that's just sort of too thorough. I don't know. I don't want to say thorough. It's not even that it's thorough because they're just picking one premise, but those end up getting unreadable very quickly. So this has convinced apparently as many people as not to stop believing in God. So I figure it's good enough for our class to sort of take a look at. If somebody's interested in more, there's plenty to go around. It's a pretty lucrative business, writing books on atheism. Writing books responding to them, however, doesn't make you as much money for whatever reason. I can speak from experience. Anyway, let me say some good things about it. Richard Dawkins is a good writer. He's a clever prosist, if that's a word. And so he's fun to read. He's actually pretty good at explaining things. I've read some of his other books on sort of particularly scientific issues, and those are all pretty good. I mean, I haven't read all of them, but the ones that I've read are pretty good. He has a couple of books just on evolution, kind of explaining it. He has some books just sort of attempting to sort of inspire people towards wonder in nature and to the sort of coolness of science, why science is sort of cool and does what it does. Those are all cool. I'm very supportive of that. I'm sure you guys would be able to guess that. So I think he's a good writer. I think he's sort of fun to read. he's pretty funny. I mean, he makes sort of little jokes in his prose that are pretty entertaining. So, and he's relatively thorough as far as the breadth of what he says, what he talks about. Now, when it comes down to actually making an argument in favor of whatever point he's trying to make, he's not very good at that. And so that's where him not being a philosopher really of any kind, I mean, that's kind of the thing that philosophers do, is make arguments. He's not very good at that. Or, for example, and I think this is sort of one of the biggest flaws in the book, presenting his opponent's point of view. He's pretty bad at that. That actually might be the biggest weakness of this book. And I think that's probably the biggest weakness of the Lawrence Krauss book we're going to read next week as well. That he doesn't do a good job presenting what his opponents are saying, especially Aquinas. I think Dawkins does a very, very crappy job presenting Aquinas' proofs, as you know if you read it. So, on the other hand, he's eminently responsible for a lot of the theism discourse that's around today, and he's pretty active on Twitter. I'm not even sure I follow him anymore because he was getting a little bit obnoxious at some point. He was, I don't know. There was a moment when he was sort of not defending, but like he had a couple of tweets sort of like saying like, I was molested as a kid. It's not a big deal, and just like, no. Anyway, but he's pretty active sort of as a figure in certain circles. So he's sort of around. A lot of people read him and have read him. And sorry, as I said, he helps to sort of create a kind of language that would, like a lot of the terms we're going to talk about today, God of the gaps, for example, he either made up that term or he popularized it. Noma, non-overlapping magisteria. That's a term that he at least popularized. Again, I don't think he came up with it. He did come up with the word meme, apparently. So when we say memes, when we talk about memes, Richard Dawkins actually invented that word. And he intended it to the definition of it to be a genetic unit of a social sort of reality. And so it's sort of the equivalent of what DNA is to biological beings. Memes are to sort of social realities. Okay, that's pretty clever. And we use the word meme, all over the place. So you give him credit where credit is due. And like I said, he talks about a lot of different topics. He has a whole chapter just on prayer and all kinds of other things. So anyway, let's get into it. What are the two types of agnostics according to Dawkins? Go to page 69. I'm going to kind of really jump through these pretty fast just because I don't know what got into me, but I gave you like 11 or 12 questions on Dawkins. Actually, let me open up Moodle site so I know what your numbering is because I changed the numbering. Okay. Number 15, what are the two types of agnostics? Page 69 is where he starts that section. It's called The Poverty of Agnosticism. I hope you have the same pagination as I do. If not, you're in big trouble. This edition's not very old, and I don't think they've come up with a totally second. This is 2008. I guess it's pretty old. Anyway, but he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about agnosticism. He thinks that you should sort of like, suck it up and just say you're an atheist. My opinion is I actually have a little bit more respect for agnostics because I don't think... Well, let me put it this way. I kind of disagree fundamentally with the way Dawkins is even sort of making the distinctions he's making. I'm not even quite sure he's an atheist, strictly speaking. I just think his definition of God is so strict. I mean, it would be like, well, I don't believe in Zeus, therefore I'm an atheist. I could say that. because I don't believe in Zeus. And his definition, what's going to end up being his idea of God is something so specific. He's basically a non-Christian, but he's saying, because I don't believe in the Christian God or the Judeo-Christian God, and that's what people usually mean by God, then he doesn't believe in God at all. But he ends up saying, well, I believe in this, and he sort of describes this thing, and then when we're reading, and you can just sort of say like, yeah, that's God. And he's going to say, no, that's not what people usually mean. So I'm not sure. I think the main glitch that he makes most consistently is that he is not good at really defining words well. And he sort of declares what he thinks words should mean, and he wants everybody to sort of follow him. And his followers do follow him. And I really think that's kind of bad intellectual... It's a bad intellectual sort of practice to do that. To just sort of change definitions, then just expect everybody to sort of follow you along with that. Even though people have been using the word God for all kinds of things other than the thing that answers prayers for thousands of years, but suddenly you, Richard Dawkins, and the generation you grew up with, and your sort of vague gut sense of how people use the word God should overturn all of that. I don't think it's a good intellectual practice. Anyway, okay. We'll go to agnosticism first. This, I guess, is a fine... This distinction is fine. He has, on page 70, one type of agnosticism is temporary agnosticism in practice. He calls it TAP. Temporary agnosticism in practice is the legitimate fence-sitting where there really is a definitive answer, one way or the other, but we so far lack the evidence to reach it, or don't understand the evidence, or haven't time to read the evidence, etc. TAP would be a reasonable stance towards the Permian extinction. There is a truth out there, and one day we hope to know it, though for the moment we don't. So temporary agnosticism in practice. Right now, I'm not quite sure where I stand on whatever the question is. And so you can be agnostic about all kinds of different questions. But there's also a deeply inescapable kind of fence-sitting, which I shall call PAP, permanent agnosticism in principle. The fact that the acronym spells a word used by the old school preacher is almost accidental. I actually don't even know what he's referring to there. The PAP style of agnosticism is appropriate for questions that can never be answered, no matter how much evidence we gather, because the very idea of evidence is not applicable. The question exists on a different plane or in a different dimension beyond the zones where evidence can reach. An example might be that philosophical chestnut, the question whether you see red as I do. Maybe your red is my green or something completely different from my color, any color I can imagine. Philosophers cite this question as one that can never be answered, no matter what new evidence might one day become available. This is the question is called that of qualia. So he's saying like, oh, there's this sort of, I guess he would maybe call them philosophical questions, that by nature can never be answered. I'm not even sure that's one of them, but whatever. He's going to go on to say at the end of that paragraph, no, the question of God, first, isn't a matter of opinion, which he's right about that, absolutely. There either is a God or there isn't. And second, he is going to sort of take the side that, no, this is a matter that reason... He's going to call it evidence, but I'm going to sort of expand that to say reason in general, can settle one way or the other. So, those are the sort of two types of agnostics. He is less fond of PAP than TAP. He thinks TAP, all right, when you get around to think about it. Now, on page 73, he has this 7 sort of layer spectrum of believers versus non-believers. Strong theist. There's 100% probability of God. The words of C.G. Jung, I do not believe, I know. Probably Aquinas would be there on number 1. 2, very high probability, but short of 100%. De facto theist. I strongly believe in God and live my life on the assumption that he's there. 3, higher than 50%, but not very high. Technically agnostic, but leaning towards theism. Then you're leaning towards agnosticism. Then you're Number 5, lower than 50%, but not very low. Or number 4 is exactly 50%, absolutely agnostic. They're equally improbable. And then so on. You can sort of look at the rest yourself. And the strong atheist, I know there is no God, with the same conviction as somebody who knows there is one. He counts himself on the next page. He's a 6, leaning towards 7. He's agnostic only to the extent that I'm agnostic about fairies at the bottom of the garden. So he's pretty close to being sure that there is no God. Again, he does give a sort of definition of God, but his definition of God, which we'll get to at some point, really it doesn't include something like the prime mover of Aristotle. He really thinks there's something that's just, that word doesn't work for again, you can sort of, that becomes a linguistic issue. To me, I would make more sense to say, all right, there's this being, if you want to call it God, fine, and it's another question whether this God is personal and, I don't know, hears prayers and sends prophets and cares about us or whatever. I mean, those are sort of all independent questions. Remember how Thomas does the Summa. Every other question is totally different than the existence of God. And what does he mean by God at the very beginning? Hardly anything. I mean, if we're going to be sort of really honest, it's just sort of like some being that's causing things to happen, this first cause of things that happen in the universe. And we have no other attributes at the very beginning besides that, besides the moving thing that isn't moved. And then later on, all right, this being is immaterial. There's a whole other proof for that. It's philosophically much smarter to just sort of divide the questions and go from there. Dawkins might reply and say, well, you're sort of like stacking the deck by calling that being God. I don't think so. I think it's much more legitimate to say, okay, that's God, but this God doesn't hear prayers. I think that's a much more clear conversation than to say, unless this being has every single attribute that I sort of grew up hearing about God, then you're not allowed to call him God. I don't know. Whatever. Okay, so those are the two types of agnostics. Does Dawkins distinguish between evidence and argument? I think you see this on page 73. He doesn't really, at least in this book, as far as I can tell, evidence and argument really just sort of mean the same thing to him. And so, on the other hand, they're two different things. This is not just like common speech. Evidence is not this. Evidence is a sort of concrete thing you can sort of look at and weigh and sometimes count. And it's a much more sort of restricted thing than an argument in general. An argument can certainly include evidence, and should, if it's going to be a good argument. But evidence isn't. So, but what I'm saying, really, what number 6? Oh shoot! You don't even have that question. I must have deleted it. Anyway, I'm just going to tell you right now. He doesn't distinguish between evidence and argument. I was going to say something else about that. Oh, he's sort of betraying that he's a scientist and not a philosopher, because a philosopher would be able to say, like, no, evidence requires interpretation, no matter what. And Dawkins, as somebody who is not just a scientist, but a subscriber to scientism, doesn't like the idea that interpretation is something that's important and sort of has a kind of skill to it. He thinks that evidence should sort of speak for itself. Most every philosopher would know that it doesn't, and that all evidence needs to be interpreted, and therefore become part of an argument, sort of larger, overarching argument. Okay, sorry for that. Well, it's an important point anyway. What is Noma? Noma, go to page 78. The section begins on page 77. Noma is non-overlapping, bottom of 78, non-overlapping magisteria. So that's to say, the magisteria means sort of the things that it's competent over, that it's able to sort of speak authoritatively on. So he's making this, I don't know, it's not his, Gould, it's the Stephen Jay Gould. He's a biologist who has a lot of stuff to say about evolution that I actually don't agree with. But his whole thing is, he coined the term NOMA, acronym NOMA, for the phrase non-overlapping magisteria, where you have, in Stephen Gould's terms, a sort of universe of fact and a universe of theory. And maybe you would say that there's like a thing that sort of maybe religion does or talks about, and there's a thing that science talks about, and they're non-overlapping. The sort of realities that religion discusses don't overlap with the realities that science discusses. For example, now, so he's saying like the ultimate meaning of things, moral value, these two magisteria don't overlap. So on this, I actually agree with Dawkins. So he says, well, I don't agree with him 100%. As a scientist and a subscriber to scientism, which basically means, the word scientism means you believe that all knowledge is what can be discovered by what we now call science. So scientism is there is no knowledge other than what science can provide. Everything else is not knowledge. And the roots of this go back to Descartes, if you're able to connect this with our discussions in philosophy of nature. So his response is going to be something like, no, it's not non-overlapping magisteria, because there is no magisterium other than science. So there can't really be any knowledge that isn't scientific knowledge. So everything has to overlap with scientific knowledge if it's knowledge. I'm going to sort of half agree with him, not in the scientism aspect, but I'm going to say I really don't think that religion and science are discussing two non-overlapping sort of parts of reality. I think both of them talk about one and the same reality under a sort of different perspective or sort of different lenses sometimes, and sometimes not. Sometimes they're, and I think the main problem with this sort of whole viewpoint that Stephen Jay Gould is presenting is he doesn't even think about philosophy. And so if you just take sort of religion, not even any particular, just religion, capital R religion, and science, capital S science, and you just sort of cram them together, that's weird. I don't think that will do anything. They both speak completely different languages. They're sort of, I mean, I guess they're non-overlapping in that sense, but there's no way to even have them communicate with each other to even know that without philosophy. And I think really philosophy is absolutely essential. You cannot do anything, any kind of dialogue between science and religion, broadly speaking, is not going to be a dialogue at all. You need something to translate one language into the other. And I think philosophy is the only man for the job. Actually, that's the next question. How does Dawkins view philosophy in general? What does this have to do with Noma? So the second part of this, what does this have to do with Noma? Well, you can't even know whether or not they overlap unless you do some philosophy. And I think Stephen Gould doesn't do that, and I don't think Dawkins does that. And there are actually big institutes that, to some degree, I have a lot of respect for, but I think don't pay enough attention to philosophy itself. So, for example, I'm sort of like tangentially related to a institute in Berkeley called the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, CTNS, and the founder of that was a great scholar and just a great human being in general, is Bob Russell. He was one of the readers for my dissertation. He founded that institute, and it's theology and the natural sciences. And I think Bob Russell has a good grip on this fact that philosophy has a really important role to play in this kind of dialogue. He himself has a PhD. I think his PhD is in physics, and then he later was studying theology. But he has a good idea of the role of philosophy. But some things that the institute does, and sort of some of their publications, could use a little bit more philosophy. But I think Dawkins is making the same mistake. Now, I don't think this is his fault, and I'm actually going to go pretty far in trying to excuse Dawkins. Not that I'm his judge and like he has to like answer to me or something, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't know how much he's really seen of, the sort of philosophical discussions on both of these topics, on science and on religion. I do know that he and his buddies are not fans of philosophy of science. Okay, so and a lot of people who ascribe to scientism in a kind of naive way really hate philosophy of science, in some ways more than they hate religion. And I think, I'll be a little bit sort of judgmental here, I think it's because it's a real threat to their presuppositions. Anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent now. So, how does Dawkins view philosophy in general? Go to page 80. It is a tedious cliche. This actually goes into a later question as well. Might be the next one. Yeah, it goes to the next one too. These are all really tied together. It is a tedious cliche, first paragraph on page 80. And unlike many cliches, it is even true that science concerns itself with how questions, but only theology is equipped to answer why questions. Okay, he makes that distinction, or it's a cliche that he's sort of quoting here. Well, look how he handles it. What on earth is a why question? Lawrence Krauss is going to do exactly the same thing. It's not that science also answers why questions. It's that a why question is meaningless. Not every English sentence beginning with the word why is a legitimate question. Why are unicorns hollow? Some questions simply do not deserve an answer. What is the color of abstraction? What is the smell of hope? You see, I mean, again, funny, clever. The fact that a question can be phrased in a grammatically correct English sentence doesn't make it meaningful or entitle it to our serious attention. Nor even if the question is a real one, does the fact that science cannot answer it imply that religion can. So what's he doing here? He's saying, well, not every question is legitimate. Well, how do you determine whether a question is legitimate or not? Nobody can do that besides philosophy. Nobody would even pretend to be able to do that besides philosophy. What happens when you don't have philosophy doing that? You have this old, wealthy British man declaring what's legitimate and what's not on his own authority without any argument at all. Just he says a couple of funny sentences, and those funny sentences are enough to put the question aside. So what does he think about philosophy? He doesn't. He just doesn't see a role for it at all, at least in this book. I think there maybe are places where he sort of, maybe we'll discuss it, maybe even it's a series of tweets or something. But here, he doesn't see any role for it at all. And I think that's to the detriment of his thought. But that's speaking as a philosopher, so what do I know? What does that have to do with Noma? I already sort of talked about that. Only philosophy would be able to tell whether two things are overlapping or not in the first place. What does Dawkins say about the difference between asking how and why? He basically says why is a meaningless question. Okay. What does Dawkins say about the difference between design and evolution? How would you respond to him? I'm not going to tell you how you would respond to him. I just want you to think about that. But design and evolution. Let's start on page 85, and then we're going to jump far ahead. Uh, 85. Sorry. Go down about a third of the way down the page. Nevertheless, there is something utterly special about the hypothesis of ultimate design and equally special about the only known alternative, gradual evolution in the broad sense. They are close to being irreconcilably different. So design and evolution, in his understanding, are irreconcilably different. There is no way to reconcile a designed universe with an evolving universe. He doesn't here give an argument for that. Let me go to page 139. Let's kind of go. This is the chapter called "Why There Is Almost Certainly No God." 139. I have it in my notes. Let's see what's going on here. Natural selection is a consciousness raiser. I go to page 142 and just kind of leave your hand there for a second. And he quotes Daniel Dennett, who is a philosopher, And Daniel Dennett is a very smart philosopher. He actually does a lot of very, very provocative work, and I know a lot of people that have respect for him as a philosopher. I'm not sure he's... Well, I have my very strong disagreements with Daniel Dennett as well. I actually have sort of a chapter in my book on him. But here's the problem. What does he say about the difference between design and evolution? He says they're absolutely different. Why? Because he defines design as something done by an intellect. Okay, fine. I'll go. So far, so good. Then he continues and he defines an intellect as something essentially complex. That's the premise that he just does not share at all with the classical theistic tradition, including Aquinas. So because he's defining an intellect as something complex, he loses sort of Thomists, for example, as an audience. Because there, the intellect, on the contrary, intellect in general should be understood as sort of, even under one aspect, even the human intellect should be understood as something approaching simplicity rather than complexity. But God's intellect is absolutely simple. And so actually this goes to the next question. What does the simplicity of God have to do with the core of Dawkins' argument? So Dawkins' argument really comes down to this. A designer is a complex being that comes before the being that it's designing. Whereas for Dawkins, and this is actually a really neat insight that I think is worth thinking about, evolution can replace design because it sort of illustrates how something simple can produce something complex, which is really... Now, what's simple about evolution? Because natural selection is an extremely simple mechanism. We talked about it in Philosophy of Nature. I'm not even going to go over it again. And in fact, one of the best places to see why that is and how that works is Dawkins' own books. So go ahead and read those. He's right, though. Evolution is a very, very simple sort of mechanism. It doesn't require tons of miracles to sort of... I mean, it doesn't require any miracles for our species that we have today to come about. Very provocative. Okay? And you guys know very, very well by now that I'm very much a believer in evolution. I don't, however, think that that's opposed to design. Because for a classical theist, you go from a complex world to a simpler evolution that brings it about, and you just keep going in the same direction, and you have an utterly simple God and the utterly simple intellect of God. God's simplicity is such that there is no distinction in him whatsoever, not even between essence and existence. Well, it would make perfect sense for an absolutely simple God to produce a world wherein a simple mechanism like evolution could bring about something with further complexity. It makes perfect sense. It flows very, very naturally. Whereas if your idea of an intellect is it must be complex, well, yeah, you're going to lose me there. Now, where's the sort of origin of this? Well, go back to a week or two. When did we talk about Hume? A week ago. David Hume, Philo, and Cleanthes are arguing, and Cleanthes is saying, well, either the mind that we're talking about is like ours and has successive thoughts, in other words, is complex, or we shouldn't call it a mind at all. So the origin of this kind of glitch is the character Cleanthes in Hume's Dialogues for Natural Religion. It might go before that, but I just don't know where its historical roots beyond that. So that's really the crux of the matter. Can we make an account for, even if we can't comprehend, but can we make an account for this possibility that God is a perfectly simple intellect? If so, Dawkins' entire argument just sort of, it's not that it crumbles, it's that the God of classical theism just sort of slips right through the net without Dawkins' argument touching it at all. Okay, so that's number 20. Okay, 21. Describe and critique Dawkins' presentation of Aquinas' proofs. Go to page 100. It's kind of interesting that's on page 100. Don't quote me that I think it's a miracle that it's on page 100. I do not. Okay. Well, take a look. Page 100, Thomas Aquinas' quote proofs. Sarcastic. Now, he does have enough respect to put these first in arguments for God's existence. And then he has the ontological proof second, which is that of Anselm. And then he does this weird argument from beauty. Aldous Huxley, I guess. The argument from personal experience. Argument from scripture. I don't know. Maybe he quotes people who do that, but I've never heard somebody try to prove God's existence from scripture. The argument from admired religious scientists that, Newton believed in God, therefore there's a God. I haven't really seen anybody saying that as a proof for God's existence. Pascal's wager, which isn't a proof for God's existence at all, and was never intended to be. Bayesian arguments about probability. I mean, honestly, after the Aquinas, I'm not saying there aren't any other good proofs besides Aquinas', but he doesn't give us any. But look at the way he presents Aquinas. Just glance at it really quick before we get into any details. Number one, the unmoved mover. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress from which the only escape is God. Something had to make the first move, and that's something we call God. The uncaused cause. Nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause, and we are pushed back into regress. This has to be terminated by a first cause. 3, the cosmological argument. There must have been a time when no physical things existed. But since physical... Okay, that's how he's summarizing the first 3 ways. You guys read the 5 ways. Look at the 4th way. The argument from degree, and then the teleological argument, or the argument from design. I mean, just pick the easiest. I'll just shoot fish in a barrel. Number 3 is the argument from necessity. It has absolutely nothing to do with time at all. The word time is not mentioned. The concept of it has nothing to do with the argument at all. But before we even get into sort of the nitty-gritty here, he's not even quoting one word of Aquinas. Now, why should he quote him? Why not? If you want to be an honest person, it's not like the proofs are that long. All 5 ways fit into like a page. Here he's summarizing not even them, and I'm going to guess here because I've sort of done a lot of the sort of background work on this. He's summarizing Bertrand Russell's summaries of Thomas Aquinas' arguments. Bertrand Russell, I would hope, would have read them. He was an actual philosopher at Harvard, but I'm not sure, Doc, I don't know, maybe now he has, but by the time of the writing of this book, I don't know if he's ever actually read the 5 ways. And if he did, he didn't read them very carefully. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads to a regress from which the only escape is God. That's not even the premise. The first premise is everything that moves is moved by another. That's actually very different than nothing moves without a prior mover. The uncaused cause, nothing is caused by itself. That's not the premise either. It's close in some cases, but close is not the same as an actual representation of your opponent's argument. So he really doesn't make any effort to try to even be fair to Aquinas. You can even see it in his language. At the beginning of chapter 3, under the Thomas Aquinas section, the 5 proofs asserted by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century don't prove anything and are easily, though I hesitate to say so given his eminence, exposed as vacuous. The first 3 are just different ways of saying the same thing. I mean, you kind of want to give him the first 2. The first 2 really are pretty close. There is a distinction between the 2, but all right, on the first 2, they're pretty close. And they can be considered together. All involve an infinite regress. That's true. And the answer to a question that raises a prior question, and so on ad infinitum. Look at page 101, though. Let's see how his response to these proofs is. All 3 of these arguments rely on the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. That's completely false. They don't invoke God to terminate a regress. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. Absolutely false. That is not at all what these arguments are doing. They're not saying there's an infinite regress, and now I'm going to invoke God to terminate the regress, that you can't go on forever. The proof is saying this cannot go on forever. That's what the proof is. That's the conclusion of the proof. It's not a premise. There's an entire argument showing this cannot go on to infinity. He doesn't represent that here at all. We went through it on the first day of class. Why this cannot go on to infinity, there's an argument for that, which I'm not going to repeat. Just go back to the first lecture and rewatch it. But he doesn't engage that argument at all. He makes it sound as if Aquinas is saying, "Behold, I declare," like it's like The Office. I didn't say it. I declared bankruptcy. I'm declaring that God is immune to the regress. No, it's exactly the opposite of that. It's that there cannot be an infinite regress, and because there cannot be an infinite regress, for the argument that we've presented, there must be a first, and that first, for the sake of argument, we're going to call God, and let's see where this goes. It's not I'm inventing God because I don't like this regress and it doesn't make me feel good. It's that the regress is philosophically impossible. And if it's philosophically impossible, there must be a first. So he's treating the conclusion of the proof as if it's a premise that's just sort of evoked out of nowhere. On the contrary, there's an entire argument for it. And instead of engaging that argument, he's just saying, well, I don't agree with that. Well, good for you. But you haven't even talked about the argument for that at all. Now look at this next part. Even if we somehow allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily, that's false, conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one. Now, there I kind of want to pause, okay, good, you admit that we need one. I hope you actually mean that. There's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. Yeah, I know. He's saying, well, Aquinas' proofs don't prove that God can hear prayers. No shit. They're never intended to. And for you to pretend that they're supposed to, and then when they don't, you act all victorious, that's either very stupid or intellectually dishonest. And I don't believe Richard Dawkins is stupid. I don't want to believe that he's dishonest, but that's actually the better of the two options. Anyway, so the other ones you read for yourself. The fifth one is not an argument from design. It's a teleological argument is a good title for it, number 5, but it's not an argument from design. Okay. What is the God of the gaps? 151. Searching for particular examples of irreducible complexity is a fundamentally unscientific way to proceed, a special case of arguing from present ignorance. It appeals to the same faulty logic as the God of the gap strategy condemned by the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So what is the God of the gaps? The God of the gaps is, you can read more about it on page 159. The God of the gaps is this idea that there's something in nature that we can't explain, and because we can't explain it, it must be God that's doing it. And Dawkins is saying that is a very stupid and bad way to think about science and to think about God. And here I 100% agree with Richard Dawkins. I think it's a very, very dumb way to do theology, to look for some problem in science and to say, oh, look, there's a mystery there, it must be God. That's an injustice to science, and it's an injustice to God. It's an injustice to science because, what are you saying? They're hoping that science fails? What does that mean? Well, if science is failing, and if it's truly science, what you're looking for really is a illogicality, a glitch in nature itself. And you're sort of hopefully kind of craving that there's going to be some problem in nature, that where something in nature doesn't make sense at all. But if you believe in a creator of nature, that's actually a flaw that's going to be in God who created it. And you're looking for God in a mistake that he made. Now, on top of that, it actually it's the opposite of Aquinas' proofs. All of Aquinas' proofs have to do with the workings of nature itself. The first mover isn't about a problem in nature. It's about why anything in nature moves at all, and so on with the first cause, all the way to the fifth way. It's not about nature failing. It's about nature working well. That's what needs to be explained, and that's what the five ways are attempting to explain. So the God of the gaps is really just the opposite. Now, oddly enough, I've tried to sort of figure out where this came from. The earliest place I can find this is actually in Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton had some issues sort of trying to settle how certain things were happening in the science that he was helping found at the time. And he's the one that said, okay, it must be God. Now, I'm not even quite sure he meant that, but that's as early as I can trace the sort of God of the gaps idea, not the name, but the very idea of it. Okay. I'm going to go a little bit fast now. What is the anthropic principle? 162. There's the planetary version and the cosmological version on page 169. The anthropic principle is a kind of sword that cuts both ways, where it seems like it's also called fine-tuning, the fine-tuning sort of argument. There are several things in nature, both when it comes to the beginning of life and when it comes to just sort of the way nature works at all. There are several factors that seem to be just like perfectly tuned for the universe to be what it is. For example, the distance of the Earth from the sun. It just sort of seems to be just at a really good distance where life could have evolved and come about. Other things called like cosmological constants, the strength of the force of gravity or of electromagnetism, as far as we know, they could have been any value, any sort of strength or power, and yet they seem finely tuned, like there's a knob that was just tuned just like to be the perfect, and if they were even a little bit off, he even describes how far off they could be. I think it's 1/10,000th off some of these values. The entire universe would have been nothing like we know it now. And so this anthropic principle can be used, oh, look, there's a fine-tuning sort of way like to see the universe, and like, wow, that must have been chosen by some creative being. Yeah, you can do it that way. On the other hand, it's a kind of a sword that cuts both ways, where you can say, well, we happen to live on the one planet that we know of out of, I don't know, billions and hundreds of billions of planets. Well, chances are one of them is going to be that distance. So it's not that there's this God that, perfectly fine-tuned to the distance of the Earth from the sun. It's that we just happen to be on that one where it happened. But there's billions of them out there. Well, there's just sort of statistical probability. I actually agree with that side of it, kind of a little bit more. What about the natural forces? Well, there you have to do something that Krauss is you can really feel cornered by this. You have to do something similar with the values in nature. That's a little bit more of a distant step here, because now you have to assert a multiverse where there are trillions or billions of universes, and we happen to be in the universe where these things are finely tuned. That's a little bit more of a stretch than the Earth being this distance from the sun. In fact, I have yet to see any actual evidence for a multiverse besides the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at least in the direction they're going. On the other hand, there has to be sort of another law that's written somewhere where each universe in the multiverse has to have a slightly different value for these cosmological constants than the previous one or the next one. But who says that should be the case? And how do we even know that these constants even... I don't really make much of the anthropic principle either way. I just be aware that it's a knife that can kind of cut in both directions. Okay, I've got two more. Let me pause. Okay, two more. This is where we see a little bit more honesty, I think, from Dawkins here. This Einsteinian sense of God. He mentions it a couple of times. One, for example, is on page 34, which is, I think, before your reading started, but I'm going to point it out to you. Bottom of 33. And this is where I was kind of critiquing his idea of defining words, I think, in what I think is really objectively the wrong way. 33 at the bottom line. Much unfortunate confusion is caused by failure to distinguish what can be called Einsteinian religion from supernatural religion. Einstein sometimes invoked the name of God, and he's not the only atheistic scientist to do so, inviting misunderstanding by supernaturalists eager to misunderstand and claim so illustrious a thinker as their own. The dramatic, or was it mischievous, ending of Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, quote, "For then we should know the mind of God," is notoriously misconstrued. It has led people to believe, mistakenly of course, that Hawking is a religious man. Okay. Hawking actually kind of went back. Stephen Hawking was the guy who had ALS, spent a lot of his life in a wheelchair, but he did a lot of great, cool work in astrophysics. There's something called Hawking radiation, which has to do with the decaying of black holes. But he wrote this book called, I think it's called A Brief History of Time. And the last line, the last sort of chapter, he's talking about this general field equation, this equation that people are seeking that is sort of like going to explain all the different forces of the universe. And he says, if we were to get to that, then we would know the mind of God. And then he ends the book there. And then Einstein, like Dawkins is pointing out, once in a while would talk about God. Now, Stephen Hawking changed his mind a few times about the problem of God, at least in print. I don't know, his internal beliefs, God only knows, I don't know. But he went from being an agnostic, and then at some point, I think towards the end of his life, he said, no, I'm just a flat out atheist. I think he changed his mind one other time, I think after that again. In any case, who cares? These are individual people, but and sort of their own particular beliefs. But Einstein, I don't think, ever called himself an atheist, and there's no reason why Richard Dawkins gets to call Einstein an atheist just because he wasn't practicing some particular religion. Now, this is where the definition kind of gets very bad. So now he's saying there's an Einsteinian religion, distinguishing that from supernatural religion, and there's an Einsteinian sense of God. What is this Einsteinian sense of God? Well, it's the God just of nature itself and sort of behind the workings of nature. And yet, that's exactly the God towards which Aquinas' proofs point. And so if Einstein is an atheist, I mean, you sort of want to, he's sort of doing something that Hume did, that Philo said, well, okay. Philo saying, well, then Aquinas is an atheist too. And he obviously isn't. And so maybe the sort of external and seeming to me arbitrary definition of God that you're requiring for somebody to be a non-atheist or a theist, maybe that's you. And maybe when Einstein said God, he meant God, and maybe let him speak for himself. Stephen Hawking, like I said, is sort of a more complicated case. And maybe, I think he might be right that it was kind of being mischievous at the end of The Brief History of Time. Oh, there's a title right there. Now, let's go to another page here. Go to page 183. This comes up again. Very top of 183. Dyson, I don't even know who that is, but he's talking about somebody, could easily refute the implication of these quotations from his Templeton acceptance speech. The Templeton Award is actually kind of a big deal. It's this big ton of money that this foundation called the Templeton Foundation gives to scholars. And it's the Templeton organization is like explicitly religious and Christian. And so they give this ton of money. And there's some questions sort of within the academic community. Well, are they sort of trying to like bribe people to sort of write about God? There's kind of like questions. There are some philosophers that I read that have accepted a Templeton Award and done some publications because of it. I don't know. It might be case by case. to sort of whether it's questionable or not, whether it skews their scholarship or their research. I don't know. Anyway, this guy's receiving this Temple award. He's saying this stuff. But let's see where this is going. If he would explain clearly what evidence he finds to believe in God in something more than just the Einsteinian sense. So now there's this Einsteinian sense of God as in this being that's sort of behind the workings of nature. This is the Einsteinian sense of God, which, as I explained in chapter 1, we can all trivially subscribe to. I think Dawkins just told us that he believes in God in the Einsteinian sense. And he just says, well, that's just not God because I get to dictate what language means and what the word God means. So, I don't know, what's my question? What's the Einsteinian sense of God for Dawkins? I've talked about that. Okay. One last quick sort of note. He does mention the simplicity of God below on that same page. My eye just kind of caught it. So he's aware of this, but he just sort of dismisses it. Go to page 184 at the bottom. Time and time again, my theologian friends return to the point that there had to be a reason why there is something rather than nothing. There must have been a first cause of everything, and we might as well give it the name God. Yes, I said, but it must have been simple. And therefore, whatever else we call it, God is not an appropriate name. Who says? Unless we very explicitly divest it of all the baggage that the word God carries in the minds of most religious believers. You see what he's doing here. He continues, again, it goes back to like reading minds and answering prayers. Divesting is different. Being neutral on the question, okay, there's a first mover or whatever, we're going to call it God. Then later on, we're going to ask the question, is this a personal being or not? Okay, it's another question. Is this a mind or not? How can a mind be simple? What does that mean? In what way do we speak about this being? Is it analogous or univocal? These are all further questions. To say that I'm not going to answer these questions, or we're not there yet, or I'm just going to be neutral on them, fine. He's not asking for that, though. He's saying we divest this name, and we say, okay, there's a God, but he does not answer prayers, or no thing, whatever. Where's the argument for that? Because that's a positive claim that you're making. I mean, you can phrase it negatively, he does not, whatever, listen to prayers or whatever, but where's the argument for that? You're saying that, I don't know, for example, Aquinas' proof doesn't prove that God answers prayers. Yeah, sure, it doesn't. That's correct. That doesn't mean that God doesn't answer prayers. There's zero logic there whatsoever. And yet here he's demanding that we divest the name God from all of these things. Be neutral about it, fine. I'm all with you. Until you prove that thing, don't take it as proven. Sure. But until you've proven it, assume it's false. I want to see an argument to accept that. And there isn't one at all. Okay, last question. How much does Dawkins' critique of religion have to do ultimately with politics? I have several different pages to go to in my notes. Let's try 61. Secularism, the Founding Fathers, and the Religion of America. This is a little bit too particular. There's a really great one. Oh, page 66 maybe. Let's see if that's it. There's a quote that I really want to... And I like this because I actually agree with it. 53 maybe. Okay, those 3 pages that I just named to you. One of it has to do with, like page 53, for example, he's talking about the money that institutions get for being religious institutes, like tax exempt status and other sort of things like that. He's saying, look, why should these groups be sort of preferred over others? That's a political economic question. I actually don't have an opinion on that. And if they end up taxing churches, by the way, don't be naive about that. What it means that the church is tax exempt, there's only a certain sort of subsection of taxes that churches don't have to pay. Property tax actually is the main one. So I have to pay taxes whenever I buy anything. I pay taxes on my salary. Like I have Social Security and everything like that. I pay Social Security. The church is taxed when it pays me. The church is taxed when it buys things. Once in a while there'll be a place. Okay, if you're there'll be like a company or a organization that won't charge us tax. But when we buy basically everything, we're paying taxes on sales tax. So don't think that the church is just like scot-free and just doesn't follow any rule. There's all kinds of stuff that we pay, just like everybody else. And there's this very stupid thing that, with COVID relief packages, and the money that went out from that, the Catholic Church received $2 billion or whatever. No, idiot. People that work for Catholic organizations got stimulus checks just like everybody else that works, just because they need them just like everybody else needs them. Idiot. I'm going to say idiot again, because people are like, the rich Catholic Church got all this money. No, the church didn't get a penny. People that worked for the church got it. And little tiny parishes that are barely scraping by, their employees got to eat. And now you're mad about that. So that's very, very stupid. I saw all these headlines a couple of weeks ago about that. Anyway, sorry, I'm mad. Later on other pages, he talks about Christians sort of manipulating politics in secular regimes. What is a secular regime? Well, you have to define it in different ways, but one of the ways to define a secular regime is a regime like that of the United States, where there isn't any official religion of the state. It's the opposite of a theocracy. There are some state theocracies around. Middle East, for example, has a number of them. The United States is not a theocracy, admittedly. In that sense, is it a secular state? Sure. In that sense, should explicitly religious doctrine determine its laws? No, not in that sense. However, if somebody happens to be religious and there's a law that it's their job to vote for according to their conscience in a democratic state, and they have a vote just like everybody else, why shouldn't they vote according to their conscience? Just because not everybody believes what I do doesn't mean I don't get to make my own vote in my own name. And if somebody votes me out and there's more people that don't believe in whatever the thing is, okay, that's the way democracy works. But it cuts both ways. And if there happens to be a city or a state or something where there are a bunch of religious people and they vote on something, whatever, like, I don't know, Utah or something, you're not allowed to sell alcohol on Sundays. I mean, that sucks. I don't like that as a Catholic. But if there's more Mormons in that state and that's the way they vote, okay, that's the way the laws are written. And that's a secular state, and it is a secular state, but this particular state happens to have religious people that are voting democratically in that way. That's not a theocracy. That's democracy with people that have a religion, or some of which have a religion. Okay, that's just the way the laws are written. You found another state and you make religion illegal and you get to sort of make those claims, but that's kind of a line too far. However, he does make a point that I actually really agree with here. That at some point it gets horrifying. And one place that I really want to point this out is and I think there's many different reasons for this, and you can make arguments for it in different ways, but one of the ways to argue for giving financial and military aid, and I've seen this, and I didn't believe it when somebody first told me about this in seminary, and I was like, "There's no way that's what's happening." And I looked into it, and it's there. One of the big reasons why the United States gives financial and military aid to the state of Israel is not because they're our ally or they're peaceful or they're whatever. All those, you could argue those are fine reasons, fine. Go ahead. And I actually don't have any opinion on the state of Israel whatsoever. But one of the reasons why U.S. lawmakers and executors and so on vote and push and lobby to send money and military aid to Israel is because of apocalyptic prophecies that they believe as Christians reading Revelation in a particular way, that the state of Israel has to accomplish certain things before the Messiah can come back. Not kidding. Maybe it's not the case anymore, but when I looked into this a number of years, maybe 10 years ago, that's one of the reasons why people vote for that, for sort of supporting the state of Israel for that in that way, because if they're secure enough and they rebuild the temple and they start offering sacrifices again in the temple, that will be a sign that Jesus will return for the second coming. And that's why my tax money is going overseas and our military is in support of the state of Israel. That is absolutely the most insane thing that I've ever heard in my life, and I'm not exaggerating. And if that's what Dawkins is against, I'm on Dawkins' side on that. That is absolutely nuts. Again, I have no opinion on Israel. This isn't even about Israel. It's that if that's what's going on, I kind of don't blame somebody like Dawkins for being as upset as he is about what's going on. And it is, to some degree, what's going on. However, are Southern Baptists or whoever these people are the only people trying to manipulate politics for their own sort of personal ends and personal beliefs? Absolutely not. There's all kinds of lobbyists, secular and otherwise. So I think that's a larger overarching problem. It's not a problem with religion. It's a problem with politics. So how much of this of this critique of religion has to do ultimately with politics? I actually think quite a bit of it does. And if, I don't know, I guess I'll end the class with this. There was a saying, I think Gandhi said this, that if he had met more Christians that were like Christ, or I think he said if he met any that were actually like Christ, he would have been a Christian himself, but he really hadn't. So again, nobody's Christ, fine. But sometimes we sort of do this to ourselves. People, fair is fair. If we are really acting nothing like Christ wants us to act like, to that degree, and I think this is in the Gospels, to that degree, it's our fault when people don't believe or have a positive attitude towards the church. Not always, but, let's accept the blame where the blame is due. That's a weird place to end, but that's where I'm going to end. All right, I'll see you next week, or I'll see you on Thursday if you have questions. Peace out.